Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Jewish Community Foundation's Access to Insight. My name is Ollie Ben. I'm the Director of Philanthropy and Social Impact for the Jewish Community Foundation. We are delighted to have you all here today. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Jewish Community Foundation, we are one of San Diego's largest grant makers, having facilitated over $1.8 billion in grants on behalf of our donors. We currently manage over $650 million in assets on behalf of individuals, families, and nonprofits. JCF is committed to building flourishing Jewish communities and advancing sustainable, just, and vibrant societies in San Diego, around the country, in Israel, and across the globe. And at JCF, we believe every individual has the power to make a difference, and that together we can change the world. A large part of our mission is to educate and inspire around philanthropy. That's certainly the purpose of today's event, but we do that in a lot of different ways. One thing that we do that's open to anybody is we want to keep you informed of what's captivating us about nonprofits, the world of philanthropy, and Jewish causes in San Diego and beyond. If you're not yet receiving our regular curated reading list, just put your name in the chat and we will add you to the list for our Philanthropy Insider newsletter. We have several of our Access to Insights in-depth series like today's one that are running concurrently. A couple of months ago, we held part one. Oh, that looks weird. There we go. A couple of months ago, we held part one of our Newish and Jewish webinar, where we focused on how California Jewish organizations were building, adapting, sustaining, and growing different Jewish life and Jewish communities. The recording of that session is available on our YouTube page and on our website. There's a link on our homepage as well at jcfsandiego.org. And so coming up on August 12th is part two of that series, where we look at how community is built in Israel. Now, obviously, that's a very different discussion because the Israeli population is very different from California, but we're going to look at several diverse community building organizations, such as Studio of Her Own, which gives Haredi, secular, converted, Muslim, and Christian female artists in Jerusalem a voice and a platform for diverse expressions of culture. Pico Kids, which is creating the next generation of STEM leaders in Jerusalem, and Eretz Ir, which is rethinking participation in urban communities across Israel. You'll be receiving a sign-up link after today's presentation for that. Finally, we've been teasing this for a while, but JCF is launching in August a major new initiative around homelessness in San Diego called Give For. Give For is our attempt to democratize philanthropy and provide everyone with the ability to tackle big local challenges, starting with homelessness. Give For will make giving impactfully much simpler, will help educate donors on the complexities of these issues, and will tell the stories of the nonprofits taking on different aspects of homelessness. On August 19th, we'll have an Access to Insight webinar where we'll bring two major thought leaders on homelessness in San Diego together to discuss how to have a philanthropic impact on homelessness, and we'll officially launch Give For at that time. There will be a follow-up, there'll be a sign-up link in your follow-up email as well. And if you're interested in learning more about Give For or being a founding partner or supporter, just stick a message in the chat and we will follow up with you. So on to today's program. I'm excited to turn it over in a second to our CEO, Beth Cyril, who will lead today's discussion with Edgar Villanueva. We're excited to hear his perspectives on philanthropy. And we expect this to be the first part of an in-depth series on philanthropy. We're not quite ready to announce the next speaker in this series yet, but we anticipate bringing additional viewpoints to encourage discussion, education, and inspiration on these thought-provoking issues. So stay tuned for details of our next event in this series. And with that, I'm happy to turn it over to the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Jewish Community Foundation of San Diego, Beth Cyril, who will introduce Edgar and start our discussion. So guys, over to you. And we will need you guys to turn your cameras on and unmute yourselves.
Okay, and can we get rid of the slide? There we are. All right. Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad that you've joined us. I think we're going to have a really interesting discussion today. We are going to learn some about Indigenous traditions and thoughts. And so I wanted to begin with an Indigenous tradition known as a land acknowledgement. I think it's a little different when we're doing things virtually because we're not all on the same land. But most of us are in San Diego County, where San Diego County has one of the largest Indigenous populations of any county in the country. And for those of us gathered in San Diego County, I would like to acknowledge the traditional ancestral unceded territory of the Kumeyaay, Luiseño, Cupeno, and Cahuilla peoples on which we are gathered and which we're going to learn together today. So I'm going to provide a really brief kind of official introduction of Edgar, because I know he won't brag about himself. And then I'm going to ask him to share more about his life experience and get into our conversation. So just to give you a sense of where he is coming from, Edgar Villanova has spent his career in philanthropy and in social change. Until recently, he was the senior vice president of the Schott Foundation for Public Education. Prior to that, he served as a program officer at the Marguerite Casey Foundation, where he was dedicated to lifting families out of poverty. And he'll share with you that poverty is something he has lived experience with. He began his career in philanthropy at the Kate B. Reynolds Charitable Trust. He has both a bachelor's and a master's degree in public health from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, as well as a bachelor's degree in theology from the Jackson College of Ministries. Very interesting. He is an enrolled member of the Lumbee tribe in North Carolina, and his native name is, I'm going to try, Edgar, Nigani Baneshi, which means leading bird. So we have a leader with us. Edgar is the author of Decolonizing Wealth, Indigenous Wisdom to Heal Divides and Restore Balance, and is founder and principal of the Decolonizing Wealth Project, both of which we're going to hear about in a few minutes. So Edgar, I shared a little bit about Indigenous tradition. I also want to share a piece of Jewish tradition. So we have a commandment called Hachnasat Orchim. It means to welcome the stranger or the other. It is the most repeated commandment in the Torah. And we welcome people from different backgrounds. And we know we can learn a lot from each other. And we are really pleased within that tradition to welcome you today to our conversation. And I know I and the people on the call are really interested to learn more about the Indigenous look at healing the world as we talk about repairing the world, and where there are similarities and differences and just different ways that the Indigenous communities are thinking about this and how it impacts philanthropy. I wanted to start with giving you an opportunity to share a bit about your lived experience. You've clearly in recent years been operating at the height of wealth, but I know that you come from the depths of poverty. So maybe give us a little bit about, where you come from and how you got there, and just, now that I did all the official stuff, give people a sense of who you are.
Absolutely. Thank you, Beth. And thank you everyone for having me and for the warm welcome. It's really a pleasure to be with you all. My relatives today, we kind of think of each other as relatives in my community. I'm speaking with you from New York City, and this is the unceded territory of the Lenape tribe. So I want to acknowledge that. My roots are down south in North Carolina. That's where I grew up. My family is still there. I'm from the Lumbee tribe, as Beth shared, which is a tribe situated in southeastern North Carolina. It's actually the largest tribe on the East Coast. We have 60,000 members in our community. Most are concentrated in that southeastern corner of North Carolina, but we have hubs of folks that have ended up in different places, like around Baltimore, and then we're kind of scattered everywhere. Most Native Americans in the United States actually live in cities, which is something folks don't realize. About 80% of us live in, in the metro areas. And you all in California have the largest population. And Los Angeles has the largest concentration of Native American folks in the entire country. So growing up in North Carolina, I had a single mother. She had me when she was 15 years old, which is like so hard to even like imagine now. But yeah, I remember when my mom was a teenager, you know, I can remember my earliest memories. And when I was 5 years old, my mom scooped me up and we moved from our community where the Lumbee tribe is situated to the city of Raleigh, North Carolina, so that she would have access to better jobs and that I would have access to better schools, which is something I think about a lot, you know, because there are two things that really kind of determine your outcomes in life based off of research, and kind of going back to my public health training. One is place, and one is your race and ethnicity. Major driving factors where we can literally look at a zip code and kind of predict how long a person would live. And so we couldn't change our race or ethnicity. So my mom changed our place, and it made all of the difference in my life. But, you know, it's actually unfortunate in a lot of ways that we had to leave our community, because I then was the only Native American in my school and throughout my entire education. And it wasn't until I got to college that I actually met other Native folks outside of my immediate family. And so I grew up, you know, really in sort of a mainstream way. And there are certain ways of being and moving through the world that I didn't know if it was because we were Native or because I was Southern, or that's just the way my mama did it, right? So it's been really amazing later in life to be deeply reconnecting to my culture and traditions, and to find things that, like, wow, this actually was a Native way of thinking or being that I just thought was how my family did it. So my mother was, and actually until this month where she's retiring, and I'm really happy about that, because I have said enough, I don't want her to do this anymore, but she's been a domestic worker, cleaning homes and taking care of frail elderly people. And so as a child, although we were very poor, I had this interesting proximity to wealth and people with wealth because of my mom taking care of their homes and their families. And I think that sort of moving between these worlds of being Native and being a non-Native world, being poor and interacting in sort of places and people who had wealth, just gave me a perspective that I guess really situated me well to work in philanthropy in the long term. But, you know, I saw folks who had wealth as just people, right? They were really nice to my family. People cared for us. We loved them. They loved us. And I didn't realize until later that there were, you know, larger systemic issues at play and a history behind, you know, that resulted in me being kind of in poverty and these folks being able to generate wealth. And so I, after school, I won't bore you with the details of going to seminary. That's a whole another story that is like really interesting. But the gist of that is that I grew up in sort of this right-wing evangelical church. My mom found religion when I was young, and there were a lot of great things about that in terms of structure and opportunities that it afforded me. A lot of things I've had to unlearn. I was raised around a lot of racism and sexism and homophobia and things that I've had to really unlearn. And that's what decolonizing is really about. It's unlearning to get to a different perspective. And there's been a lot of folks who have extended grace and understanding and have had hard conversations with me through the years that have really pushed me to think and move through the world differently. And I'm still learning and growing. So I appreciate your grace for me today, and I hope to learn with you. I got into philanthropy right out of graduate school. As Beth said, I studied public health, and I had this really unique opportunity that the largest health foundation in North Carolina was looking to diversify their staff. They wanted folks with lived experience. They were looking for someone younger. I think I was 28, starting as a program officer. The next youngest person was like in their 50s. And at that time, I thought that was so old. Now I'm like, that's young. You know, and I entered this wonderful, wacky world of philanthropy, and increasingly just became super passionate about understanding the art and science of philanthropy and grant making. There's so much good that we do in the world. And because I love this work, because I love this sector, I've really tried to be intentional about continuing to push us to surface hard conversations, to think about how we can have even a deeper sense of justice and purpose in how we do our work.
Awesome. So I think I mentioned to you when we were talking yesterday, there's sort of, I think, of one elephant in this room that I'm just going to address going in. Um, in your book and in conversations, you use the term white supremacy. And in the Jewish world, when we talk about white supremacy, generally speaking, we're talking about the Ku Klux Klan and the Proud Boys and Nazi Germany, and really racial and anti-Semitic hatred. And, you know, in the current context of really rising, like fearfully, you know, intensely rising anti-Semitism in America right now, you know, we are painfully aware of being, you know, othered, if you will, even though we present as white. And yet you use the term more expansively. And I sort of want to ask you to help us understand how you're using the term, and how does that impact your philanthropy. And you know, as I said to you, we want to be, we want to educate people and provoke people into thinking about their philanthropy in new ways. So where is your lexicon coming from, and how are you sort of teaching people about that without making people too uncomfortable?
Yeah, really great question. You know, I begin with really explaining that when we talk about whiteness or any type of race, you know, race is a construct. It's something that somebody made up, right? It's not even like a real thing, but it was a construct that was made up to by folks in power to maintain power. And if you study the history of race in the United States context, especially, who is defined as white has actually changed over time. At one point in time, if you were considered to be of Italian descent or Italian, you were not white, you were something else. Irish folks at one point were not considered to be white. And actually, when I think of the word white, like the most whitest person I think of is like an Irish person, which is so kind of funny. But, you know, it is this construct that was created that, you know, to really play games and to hoard power and to put people in boxes and to oppress other people. And again, that definition has changed to benefit the folks in power. And the reason they changed it and allowed, for example, Italian folks to be considered white at a certain point in time is to consolidate power, right? And to build power against other new folks who were coming into the country, or against the African-American population that was beginning to kind of grow. And there was fear post slavery that folks Black folks would take power and all of that. So the idea of white supremacy is not, when we criticize or name white supremacy, we're not talking about white people. We are talking about an ideology that was made up, which goes to say that whiteness, or the people who are check that box, or the people who are defined by whiteness, this construct, it's an ideology of those people are better than. They are superior. They are more beautiful. They are more smart. And it's this false ideology that has been baked into our way of life in this country. It is in the media messages that are pushed out through those vehicles. It is something that we've all internalized. It's the beauty standards in this country are what is considered beautiful is that mostly aligns with these ideas of that white is better. And so the truth is that race is a construct. It's not real, but we have to, but there have been very real consequences to that construct. Public policies have been designed around this construct of race to benefit people who are considered white. Our cultural practices have been constructed around this construct. And so we have to move through the world understanding that there are real consequences to these ideologies around race that exist in our country, whether we subscribe to them or not. Also, I just want to name the complexities in it all, that all these things are true, that you may be from a people who have experienced oppression and struggle, and at the same time, while that has made you a resilient people, have benefited from being able to pass as white and check that box. In the same way that myself, as an Indigenous person, I'm Native American and I come from that history. I'm actually a very light-skinned Native American. I'm also white passing. I hear all the time from people, "You don't look Native American." And I'm like, well, I'm sorry, please explain to me what we're supposed to look like so I can let the creator know they made a mistake. And so that's really the difference. So when we say white supremacy, I think the same thing. I think of the Proud Boys, the KKK, and those kinds of things come to mind. But it's also the more subtle ways that these ideas of whiteness being the best, and the only, have actually permeated our way of life, and we've all internalized that in ways that are benefited from that, in ways that we have to acknowledge, because it's just the way it is in this country and what we've internalized, regardless of your ethnicity. If you're walking down the street and you present as white, you're much more safer than a Black person walking down the street, less likely to be shot by a police, more likely to be offered a job opportunity and to benefit from lots of policies and things that are in place that have been designed to support whiteness. I hope that is kind of clear. That was a lot.
No, I think, and as you and I also talked about, it is, the Jewish community presents as white, but many members of the Jewish community in their dress, and we've seen now recently in the United States how much appearance is reducing safety. So another of our commandments, which really drives a lot of what we at the foundation do and what our donors are up to, is Tikkun Olam, which I know you have heard of, repairing the world. So we speak about repairing the world. The Indigenous community, as I understand it, speaks about healing the world. Seems really similar to me. And I know from reading your book, there are 7 steps to healing. Talk to us a little bit about the Indigenous approach to a healing, and how does that and the discussion we just had, about race, well, how is that driving philanthropy, or how would you like to see it drive philanthropy in your mind?
That's a great question. Yeah, we are kind of obsessed with the topic of healing in Native communities. And I think it's because we've been through so much, and in the same way that a lot of folks from you all's community may, I think that oppression and that history, prepares us to be healers, actually, to be able to help others find their healing. So I think in Indigenous communities, we have this idea of the 7 generations. It's one of our sort of principles. And it is to say that anything, decisions that we make, experiences that we have in our lives will impact 7 generations to come. And unfortunately, there is such recent trauma in our communities and Native communities around the country that we are in active trauma, and we're really trying to center healing in everything that we do, so this trauma is not passed on to our children and to our children's children. Our trauma is very, very recent. You probably have seen the news headlines about the children's bodies of children being found at Indian boarding schools in Canada and now in the US. And this idea of Indian boarding schools is very recent. This is my grandparents' generation. This wasn't decades ago. This was Indian boarding schools just stopped operating in 2003 in Canada, and in the US in the 60s. And so I know people who are completely traumatized by what happened there. For folks who may not be familiar, Native children were taken from their families and forced into boarding schools by the Catholic Church and by the federal government and the government in Canada, and not allowed to speak the language, under this motto of kill the Indian, save the man. And so our culture was completely stamped out, and there was lots of abuse. And now we're understanding there was actual just literal genocide happening, right? And so this is stuff that is re-traumatizing and currently traumatizing our communities. So we think about healing, we talk about healing, we hold spaces for healing all the time. I've done so much healing work in my life, and it's a beautiful thing. In the context of philanthropy, when we think about wealth and where how wealth has been accumulated in the United States, how our economic system here was founded upon slavery, like literally founded upon slavery, literally established upon ideas of hurting people, extracting from people, and harming the planet. There's a lot of harm that has happened historically in how wealth has been accumulated. There's a lot of harm that still is happening to people and to the planet in order to help others amass wealth. And that's something that we, those of us who have resources, have to be honest about. Like, you know, a lot of it is something we don't think about. It's sort of, we're so accustomed to these dynamics, and or we may feel powerless to do anything about it, or we may not know the history of how wealth came to be in our families. And even if wealth was built in a way that feels and seems completely, you know, real innocent, right? Someone was a business person, made a lot of money. We still have to acknowledge there were accumulated benefits that allowed for that person to make and generate wealth in a system where others were not allowed the same privileges. You know, in Native communities, for example, you know, Apple computer has been around longer than our ability to our right to vote. We were just allowed to start voting fairly recently. Lots of policies excluded people of color that created a middle class and benefited white people in this country. And so the idea of healing is, or decolonizing wealth, is really simply about acknowledging that there is trauma that exists because of how wealth has been accumulated, and asking ourselves, what responsibility or what opportunity do we have to use money in a different way to help repair? How do we repair? We can't undo what has happened, but we can think about how can we heal, and what is the role of money and wealth in helping to support that healing across our country.
So just relative to a question in the chat, which I'm sort of going to reframe, but how do you see, or can a community like the Jewish community, on the one hand, and many of us listening in today are clearly individually privileged, you know, how do you help a community think that is, can a community be considered both privileged and discriminated against at the same time? So how do we, you know, how should we view our own struggles versus those of other groups? Like, you know, I know, you know, right this minute in the United States, the fastest growing set of hate crimes and violence is, you know, is anti-Semitic. But as I said, you know, clearly, you know, I am sitting on land in La Jolla. You can't exactly argue that I'm not pretty privileged. And so there's a tension there that I would love for you to help us, as people think about, you know, how they give back, how to think about that.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we have to acknowledge and accept that all these things can be true at the same time. There's lots of contradictions. It's not an absolute either or situation. It's both and. You know, we can think of any segment of the population, you know, women, for example, right? There's still discrimination, gender discrimination that happens, right? We know that women, when you look at data, don't get paid as much as their male counterparts in the same kind of jobs, right? But still, when we think about race, white women are absolutely making more money than Black women, right? So when you bring sort of the complexity of race over any existing oppression, you're going to see those disparities exacerbated. We can talk about people with disabilities, right? When we think about the disparities that they face in this country, when you apply the lens of race and you think about people of color who have disabilities, you're going to see a lot more complex suffering and disparities in access to services and supports for those folks. And so it's acknowledging that we all have pain, we all have our unique struggles, and we need to take care of our community. We need to fight this growing oppression and hate. And at the same time, we can hold that contradiction that I, you know, also have benefited from the system that is rigged in the favor of white people. And so both things are true. Both things are absolutely true. I hold that contradiction as a Native person who, is holding that trauma in my body from my history and what's been handed down to me. Yet I've been afforded opportunities because of my light skin privilege, and in a system where I can pass and benefit. And I've been able to generate, money and income for myself. And I have access to tables and power that many people in my community don't have. And that's a privilege that I have to hold, and a complexity. And all those things are just true at the same time. It doesn't mean if you acknowledge that you have some privilege that your pain and suffering is not real.
Someone just reminded me in the chat, and it is true. Well, two things. I mean, I was just thinking as you talked about 7 generations that, we are seeing as we're getting 3 and 4 generations past the Holocaust, that trauma, does translate. We aren't at 7 generations yet. So, and there's a challenge there around a certain amount of wanting to keep that alive, because you don't want it to be forgotten, but you also don't want it to traumatize people anymore. And so there's definitely a balance there. But someone also reminded me, and it is true, that up until the early 1960s, Jews couldn't live in La Jolla. As I say, I'm sitting here. So that, one of another question that someone asked, which I think kind of goes to this: as a first-generation American, what is my responsibility for the genocide perpetrated upon indigenous peoples before my time? Or put another way, what is a younger German citizen's responsibility for genocide perpetrated against my people before they were born? And,
wow.
and they're good questions.
That is a really good question. You are asking
I told
me
you
the
I
hard questions
had a
today.
good audience coming. I told you.
Yeah, these are very, very tough questions. I think, I believe that, we are all here, however we got here, and we've inherited a history. We've inherited the history of this country, good, or better, bad, worse. I think that if it is to be for there to be social change, for there to be healing, for there to be a new type of society where everyone feels like they belong here, then we have to all take collective ownership for how we got here. It's very easy for us all to kind of say, well, we weren't here. We didn't make those decisions. But we have to take ownership that this is our country. This is our place. This is, and there are things that in the history that we're not proud of, but we got to figure out a way to fix it, to change it. And I think to get there, it has to be a collective responsibility that we all feel like we share. And part of the challenge I think that we're having in this country right now, where we see so much division and separation and racial violence, is because we haven't reckoned with that history. The United States is one of the only countries where there have been, massive human rights violations against Indigenous people, against Black people, that has not received an apology from the federal government. And, there's never been an official congressional apology to Native folks for every broken treaty. There's never been an apology for slavery. And in fact, there's a fight right now around like what type of history is even taught in school and what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. And history is actively being changed and erased. In 27 states in this country, Native Americans are not even mentioned in K-12 curriculum. Right. And so there's something about our culture in America where we're very much into innovation and looking forward and futurism and all of that, because we don't want to deal with the pain. And I totally get it. I'm a very positive person. I don't want to sit around and grapple with this heavy stuff forever, but I want us to get well. I want us to like dive into it and like rip the Band-Aid off and like really come to terms with it and figure out what we all have to do to move forward together. And so I do think there's a collective ownership of, anyone who comes to this place to, if this is your place, then you got to deal with the mess that this place has and help us clean it up.
Wow, it's hard. And I was just thinking, I read I want to say this week, coming up next week, the Church of England is actually issuing an apology to the British Jewish community right about now. And I don't know enough about it to comment, but I know I saw it. So, you know, it's an interesting point. It sort of leads to the next sort of area. You use an expression, and I love this expression, money as medicine. So share your view of philanthropy where money is medicine.
Yeah. So in Indigenous cultures, medicine for us is something that is sacred. It's something that we feel makes us whole or restores balance in our lives. It can be anything simple, like, right? It can be like, maybe I've had a bad week and I want to have a coffee date with a friend that makes me laugh really hard. And then I feel good again and everything's right in the world. That was like medicine, right? It may be a trip to the spa to get sort of recentered. Anything that you allow your intuition to determine, to be medicine can be medicine. And so we also believe that you don't choose the medicine chooses you. And there was just a certain point in my career where I was feeling a little bit disillusioned by philanthropy and some of the pomp and circumstance around how we do our work, and also feeling like seeing some injustice, I thought, in terms of the lack of investment in communities of color. When you look at giving data across the United States, less than 10% of grants go to communities of color. And so, that's really a major injustice, in my opinion, considering, all that people of color have done in this country to help generate wealth and build wealth in this country. And so the idea is that, we all have to think about how do we heal that, and what is the role of philanthropy? If the accumulation of wealth, if we can just hold that assumption for a moment that the accumulation of wealth has caused trauma, it's caused pain, and we have this race wealth gap that exists because of very intentional policies to oppress some and to benefit others, then it's not really about the money. It's really about us people who have made these policies and use money to harm communities and to harm the land. Can we flip that paradigm and say, well, how can we use money if it's actually neutral, if it's actually sort of like symbolic of energy, in a way that helps to repair? Like, we'll never undo all the things that have happened, but we can think of a form of repair or a form of reparations to help at least address some of the harm that has been done. And if we invest where the hurt is the worst, if we are really helping those most in need, then we are using our money as a form of medicine to help restore balance and to repair the harm.
I'm taking in the chat. We're getting a lot of comments.
I love all of the comments and questions in the chat.
Support for recognition of our privilege, but also expressing the view that Jewish experience is unique and, not necessarily comparable to other groups. And I do want to thank everyone for their comments. I can't address all of them today, and I've written back to some of you, and there's a limit to how much multitasking I can do here. I do have one of our donors. I just made a very nice comment. It seems that recognition of our privilege in a non-defensive manner is the first step to becoming an effective ally for change. Once more of us openly recognize our privilege, we can be agents for change through advocacy and philanthropy to organizations that are best situated to help those negatively impacted by our privilege. Just saying.
Beautifully
said. I think that's a synopsis really of what you're suggesting. And it doesn't in any way deny our history or our current situation. It just says that there are other people in oppressive situations and in disadvantaged situations, and whether or not we are privileged or disadvantaged doesn't detract from our obligation to help others who are disadvantaged.
Absolutely. And in the context of this particular place where we're living within these United States, from the very early launch of this nation, there's been systemic racism built into how things were constructed, and specifically anti-Black racism. And so it's just something that we have to acknowledge that There is colorism and there's racism, and where we sit on that chart, that is kind of silly to simplify it in that way, actually does lead to privilege or oppression, regardless of, like, you know, other types of experiences that we've had.
Right.
You know,
And
both things are true.
Right. And the same is true of gender and homophobia and people who are quote unquote who are differently abled, I guess I should say.
Absolutely.
And that, you know, wherever you sit, there are always people who sit in better, you know, in more privileged places and less privileged places and disadvantaged places. And it's our obligation to be cognizant of that and use our philanthropy as we can to impact that. I want to just ask you a couple questions in the time that we have about some of the specific work that you're doing. I know you are on the board of the NDN Collective, which is really doing, from what I've been able to tell in my research, really, really compelling work, particularly with Indigenous communities around the country in access to capital, in the building of wealth, and not in the rebuilding and the building back better of the Indigenous community for self-sufficiency and to sustain culture and language without having any negative effect on, you know, on non-native people. And so I'd love to just know a little bit more, or just share with people what the NDN Collective does. And for people who want to go look at it, I actually have not met the executive director of the NDN Collective. I am really interested to, because he is half Jewish, and I find that I'm dying to have a conversation with him about what it is to grow up with these two cultures.
Yeah. Oh my
so tell me about the NDN Collective.
Yeah, you all have to hear Nick Tilson speak and meet him at some point. He's amazing. I describe him as the one we've been waiting for. That's kind of the name that I tease him with. You know, Indian Collective is an amazing nonprofit. It's an all Indigenous team of grassroots organizers, leaders, folks who are communication and media strategists. And it's an organization that's focused on building political power for Native Americans in this country. We've never had, we really haven't had like a national civil rights kind of organization historically. And so Indian Collective is really standing in that gap to really make sure that we are visible as a people. Invisibility is our greatest threat. Most folks don't, there's studies that have come out to show that a lot of people don't know that we exist or that we survived. And if they know anything about natives, it's relegated to sort of a relic of the past, right? If you Google Native American, you will not see anyone who looks like me. You will see pictures of Geronimo and Sitting Bull. And so we, again, as I was saying earlier, 80% of us live in cities. We are very modern people. We do all the same things and go to the same schools and all of that. But that lack of visibility is really an impediment for our ability to thrive. And so Indian Collective does a fantastic job of elevating the issues that matter to our community and pushing back on false narratives about our community. As well as really helping to support and build wealth. Native-led nonprofits across the U.S. have only received 0.04% of philanthropic gifts, and even in that, we can say many of those organizations are not led by Native folks. And so one of the things that Indian Collective is doing, and in my work at Decolonizing Wealth Project, we partner a lot around this, is help fundraise basically and move money to those organizations that are led by our people, as well as, an impact investing fund that they operate at Indian to help entrepreneurs start up businesses and build wealth in communities. They are just truly amazing. I'm so proud to be associated with Indian Collective.
And someone did ask in the chat for the website, so someone else put it in the chat. Yes. It is ndncollective.org, like ndncollective.org. So in the Decolonizing Wealth Project, which you founded, I want to say 2 or 3 years ago.
Yes.
Can't remember.
2018. Yeah.
So you just received a substantial grant from Mackenzie Scott when she just did her most recent, I mean, in total, it's, I want to say about $8 billion that over the last year, she has given in unrestricted grants to a variety of organizations. And it is totally unrestricted, so you can do with it what you want. So tell us a little bit about what are your plans for, I mean, relative to your budget. I don't remember the numbers and it's not important, but relative to your budget, it's a lot of money. So what are you thinking?
It was a very meaningful gift. For our organization, almost all of our money is unrestricted because it's sort of our business model to, our fund is called Liberated Capital. We are an organization that works with people who have wealth and donors to, support them on their journey and understanding around issues of racial equity. And then we have a fund that creates opportunities for folks to actually give. One of the big differences with our fund is that we center community and people of color leaders in making decisions about those funds. So in our donor community of 300 members who give monthly, they don't get to say which issues or which communities or what. It's really trust-based philanthropy to say, we believe that people living in these communities most impacted by these problems have the best solutions for what their communities need. And so we work with advisors across Indian country and in the Black community to actually help us get the funds out the door. And so restricted funding is not something that we really take from folks. So Mackenzie's gift to us being unrestricted is fantastic, and it kind of goes along with how we do our work. We are a nonprofit that is working to redistribute wealth, and we received a number of gifts. This gift, although meaningful, we haven't disclosed the full amount because we don't want to sort of create feelings of competition and really kind of contribute to that. It's not the largest gift we've actually ever received at Decolonizing Wealth Project because we work with so many donors who are generous and are really wanting to support the work of racial justice and want to trust Indigenous and Black folks to take their money and really have confidence that we know how to redistribute that. So what we're going to do with it is redistribute. We are, our budget is covered for this year, and we are going to launch a number of initiatives that we were going to launch anyway, but we'll just have more money to get out the door to organizations led by Black, Indigenous, and people of color. We're doing work in the climate space this year. We're going to do some narrative change work. We're supporting racial and economic justice campaigns across the country. We're going to be supporting healing and truth and reconciliation. We're actually doing work in California. You may know that you all have a Truth and Healing Commission that was started out of the governor's office that's working with tribes across California. We're going to be making grants to support Native communities across California to be at the table, to have what they need if they need transportation or childcare, whatever they need to be present and available to be a part of that healing process. So yeah, we're just going to fuel this, this redistribution of resources to support communities across the country, led by people who have historically not had access or benefited from philanthropy, in the same ways.
So, in a technical question about philanthropy, which I also touched on with you before, I totally understand unrestricted funding, and I completely get the trust and the idea that those who are going to be helped should be determining how money is being spent. And from that standpoint, I really admire Mackenzie Scott enormously, because she is saying, look, I trust you. You know what to do for your people. Where this piece of philanthropy breaks down for me is that there's no mechanism. Like, you're going to do something with that money. Some of it's going to work out great and do exactly what you expected. And in other cases, there are going to be unintended consequences, or something's not going to go quite how you had hoped. And if that's not the case, then you're not pushing the envelope and you're not innovating. You're not trying to get the most out of it. And there's no mechanism in here around learnings. And so all of this money has gone out to, I forget how many, a few hundred nonprofits, and they're all going to do, they're all going to do different things with it. And some things are going to work out better than other things, and some things are not, because people are going to try different things. And there's no mechanism for learning such that we don't all make the same mistakes many, many times. And so I'm wondering, how do you combine unrestricted funding with wanting to learn, particularly from mistakes? Because there are people, no philanthropy goes perfectly. Nothing goes perfectly.
I think it's, I'm sort of in a camp that many of these communities have been so marginalized from investment historically that I just want them to get the money, and I almost don't care what they do with it. Right? We have a direct cash payments program at Decolonizing Wealth. We gave out $1.1 million directly to Native folks across the country during COVID, and we did not monitor or force people to tell us how they were spending their money. Because I really want to believe that kind of push back on an idea that poor people aren't responsible. They don't know what they need, and that I know better, and that I should prescribe how they have to report back to me and tell me what they did. We did, but at the same time, I do want to know if our program was effective, right? So my way to do that was that we invited folks, if they wanted to share stories with us, send us a video. And, and we did actually send out a survey, and that was optional, and gave folks some compensation for filling out the survey. And we learned a lot about our program that was really meaningful. I think that the groups who got, I know for us, at least with all of the resources we're receiving, we regularly share information. We put out reports. We talk about our work all over the country. We hold funder briefings where we invite the folks we're supporting to do webinars and talk about what's happening in communities so that our donors feel connected and engaged. I think most effective nonprofits are going to find a way to not just take the check and run, because you want to be in relationship with your donors, but in a right relationship. You don't want to feel that a donor is imposing, or kind of this forced assimilation into a logic model or a theory that may not work for your community. But, when I have that freedom to actually respond to my community in a way that I feel is appropriate, and to run our organization in a self-determined way, it actually makes me want to talk to my donors more. Because I don't feel, we have these titles in foundations like program officer, which I think is like I've been a program officer for years. It almost kind of gives this connotation of policing, and I'm coming in to really like scrutinize but I think we have to just trust the nonprofits that they will be sharing and putting out reports. I think we're going to see some amazing growth. And I'm also just satisfied with the fact that we're moving away from this 0.04% of money going to natives, right? That in itself is a major impact or outcome if we see that increase and get to parity based off, percentages of our population, or however we want to measure that.
That makes total sense. I just asked because we do, when we talk to donors, we want to encourage people to make sure that the grants that they're making are being effective.
Yes.
Not to necessarily tell somebody or some organization how to be effective, but when you make a grant, you're making a grant to an organization whose mission and vision you believe in. And Absolutely. Then you want to know that your grant did something to further that mission or vision. And so I keep wishing that, that Mackenzie Scott had set aside, some amount of money for some summit of all of her grantees, with some way of showing those videos and sharing those conversations, and all the press that would get, that there would just be such an explosion of learning.
Yeah, I will say, I think I'm allowed to say this. that they have asked for reports back. So it wasn't
Oh,
it was a
okay.
here's the money, goodbye forever. It's very non-invasive. It's very much like, just send us what you probably are already doing, an annual report. You have full, freedom to do your work in your own way. But so maybe from collecting some information back, there'll be some sharing in the future. We'll see. But I'm really fascinated. I think this is a major case study for how philanthropy is shifting
Right.
because of the way Mackenzie Scott is giving.
Right. And it's going to be wonderful and interesting to see, what happens. So I have to wrap up. And before I do, we did receive more comments and questions in the chat and in the Q&A that I can't get to everything. I would encourage you to email me or call me, and I'm happy to talk to you about it and to funnel questions through to people who can answer them. Or, if you're looking for more information on something, I can certainly get that for you. So please, we don't have to end the conversation here. Just as a last, Edgar, obviously most of the people participating today are Jewish. And I know you have a number of Jewish donors, and that you've that you're becoming more and more aware of the commonalities and the differences and so forth. So just give us some closing reflections on what, sort of where you see the commonalities of Indigenous experience and the Jewish experience in America. And just sort of any closing thoughts to this community as we're, as takeaways in the context of a Jewish audience.
Yeah, I'm learning so much about Jewish people and the faith, and especially since I've moved to New York, where there's a fairly large population, and folks have so been welcoming and are allies and friends in this work. And I do see so many similarities. I think what makes our philanthropy special is that it is deeply rooted to culture and to faith and spirituality. It's not necessarily just an intellectual exercise or something maybe we do to just be a good citizen, but there's a deeper meaning and connection to giving back. It is deeply connected to faith and to ideas of reciprocity, and deeply connected to relationship, right? And I think that's why, Beth, you're asking the question about wanting to learn, because I think Jewish donors want to be in relationship often with community and folks that they're supporting. So, I think that we have a worldview about philanthropy that is modern philanthropy, or should be the future of philanthropy. That is really, philanthropy means love of people. Literally, the word means love of people. And so I think that we've gotten super professionalized in our field and with our practices and our conferences. And sometimes we just forget the basics, that this really is about the idea of all my relations, that we are interconnected, our interdependence is inescapable, that my ability to thrive deeply is dependent on your ability to thrive. And I think if others shared those kind of common values and worldview, that this field would be even better, and we would have, the world would just be a better place in general. So I really appreciate you all who are donors to this foundation, and the spirit that you give, and for being open to learning and listening, and from others outside the community. It's really a beautiful practice. So I'm grateful.
I think I mentioned to you that we, sometimes as Americans, we tend to emphasize our individual rights. Mm-hmm. And Jewish tradition really speaks of our collective responsibility. And Absolutely. It's in that spirit that we have tried to have this conversation with you today. So I really appreciate your time. I know you have got, I know from the chat and the Q&A that you have a lot of people thinking. And really the Jewish Community Foundation, as Ollie said at the beginning, one of our core functions is to educate and expose. And we fully recognize that not everybody agrees on everything. We are a big tent now in the Jewish community, and we just try to have conversations with people and to get people thinking, and then encourage people to conduct their philanthropy accordingly. So We really are grateful for your input today, and appreciate your time and thoughts. And we'll say Lahitra Oat. That means we'll see you later. Not goodbye. That means we'll see you later.
Absolutely. I'll be coming to La Jolla hopefully before too long.
Well, I look forward to welcoming you in town. So thanks
Beautiful.
so much. Lovely to get a chance to speak with you.
Thanks,
Have a good
everybody.
afternoon.
Appreciate
Bye.
it. Bye-bye.